Sometimes in spirituality, we talk about the difference between the little self and the universal self. And sometimes we can, based on the words alone, we can create this kind of association or just to kind of create this belief that our person is not like a good thing, I guess. And, I understand that kind of thinking very much because it's something I had to kind of work through during my own spiritual path. And the thing is like, if you do get into maybe say like Advaita or Zen or Taoism or I don't know. I don't even know why I'm naming specific paths right now because I think this is something that you ultimately find in any spiritual path. There's always this kind of juxtaposition between what we consider to be our individual person or maybe our more egoic self and the universal self and the universal consciousness. And I just, this is just, you don't have to, there's nothing wrong with your person. There may not even be anything wrong with your ego. That might rub some people the wrong way to hear that one. But hear me out before you making any assumptions about it. It's just that, the sense of the spirit as spirit, as consciousness, we play through the person. We experience the dynamic life through the sense of an individual person. That's how this reality is meant to be experienced. It's like your person and, along with the body and the conditioning of that person, that's kind of a prerequisite for you to have a human experience. So there's nothing wrong with your humanness. There's nothing wrong with your individual sense of a person. Where it gets kind of screwy and seems to get confusing is where the person forgets that it's the spirit. And then it begins behaving outside of the universal harmony. And it begins behaving as though, the cosmic compulsions and the spiritual intuitions and the guidance that's coming from within is actually all the ego's doing. The ego is laying claim to all the creations and all the intuitions and all the guidance. And so inevitably you find that the quality of that guidance and the quality of those creations and the quality of the interactions that person has, it really begins to diminish, and it becomes much more self-centered, much more egoic, in the more classical sense, where it becomes like selfish, basically. It's not that the person itself is wrong. It's just that when it becomes kind of separate from the spirit, it imagines itself to be separate from the spirit. Then it's like water being separate from this great flowing river of life, and then it just kind of pools up and becomes stagnant. And yet the whole time it's claiming to be, glorious. Because, when you're separate, when you feel you're separate, you feel you're isolated, it creates a lot of fear. Because we know intuitively that our true source of sustenance and our true source of providence in life, it does come from the spirit. It does come from this universal harmony. It does come from this self, this universal self, this being. And so when we are separate, we feel the sting of that separation. And, that's when our ego can kind of take over a bit. And it can start to, we start to behave as though we need to compensate for our separation by, puffing your chest up and, now I have to take control for myself, or otherwise I'm going to be pushed around like a leaf on the wind. And so, people get really hooked into that. And the sad thing about it is that a lot of people, they actually do achieve a certain degree of success on on that premise that they are separate, that they are isolated, that they have to do everything on their own, or otherwise it's the end, or otherwise it's just they're not worthy of love or of joy. They're just not worthy if they're not doing everything on their own or something. There's a lot of strange ideas that we get when we operate under that illusion of separation. Both the illusion of separation from the natural environment, the illusion of separation from one another, but also ultimately the illusion of separation from our own spiritual essence, what we are. And so, when you do come back into that natural sense of being, what happens is that it's not that you're surrendering yourself, because what it is that whatever you can surrender to the being was never you to begin with. So you can't really surrender yourself to yourself. Wouldn't you just be yourself at that point? But sometimes it just can feel that way, because it's like you get so habituated to believing that you are that illusory thing, that separate person, that you're not even aware that there's a spirit. Some people aren't even aware that there's a spirit. And by the time they become aware that there's a spirit and that they actually are that spirit, they become so habituated to, see the world through their own personal lens and their own kind of phobias and their own projections and desire systems. And it's all based on a shaky foundation that ultimately has to fall back into the true stability of the self, of the universal being. And when that happens, there can be some fear, there can be some discomfort, there can be quite a bit of it, actually. I can certainly attest to that in my own case. But you know what? I really would not have it any other way. And ultimately, no matter how difficult this transition can be at points in time, I honestly, if I had the opportunity to go back in time and do it all over, I would have it happen the exact same way. Because everything that can be taken from you, everything that you can surrender to this being, is not what you are. And everything that you give to the being comes back to you in a more refined and basically a more harmonious form. You give away your bad habits so that they can be replaced with harmonious habits. You can still have a lot of the same interests and desires and passions, but they get cleaned up so that they're no longer a problem for you, and they're no longer an affront to the lives of others. It's not so much the things that we do in life, it's how we do them. It's the relationship that we have with this world. It's not the world itself. It's not the person itself. It's not even other people. Or the crazy things in the world. That's not even the problem, really. It's our relationship with those things. And when you rest in this presence and you let go of your illusory sense of yourself, which is a limited sense of self ultimately, the person that you then re-emerge as is the same person you've always been. It's just cleaned, and it's more harmonious, and it doesn't put on such airs. It doesn't try so hard to to achieve things that really are not so useful in the end. The spirit informs you from within, and it's like the voice of God becomes your own voice. And every heartfelt inspiration is a channel directly from the source itself. there's really nothing to be afraid of. Although fear is not your enemy. Fear can arise, just like all the feelings can arise, you see. There is never anything wrong with the feelings. There was never anything wrong with the thoughts. It's just the relationship that we have with those things. And when you believe that you're separate and you're a little person in this great big world and you got to do everything on your own or otherwise it just won't happen, then, stronger emotions and, negative thoughts can have such a weight to them. They can take on a quality that they just don't have on their own. When you're really stabilized in the spirit, in your being, true being, fear is just a feeling. Pain is just a feeling. The various disharmonies of life actually, they're actually just the river kind of cleaning out the mud. Sometimes you step into a shallow pool of water and some mud comes up from the bottom and then the water is dirty, but you know what? It cleans itself out. Because the water is inherently harmonious. The flow of the earth is inherently harmonious. The outer nature is the same as your inner nature. Nature is nature. No matter whether it's inner nature, outer nature, it's all nature. It flows and it moves in the same way. And just in the same way that all the plants and all the animals and all the living things come from the soil of the being, they also subside into the soil of being to be nourished and sustained and also to come back in a new form. So it's the same thing when we let our old self die. It's not us that dies. It's the limitations that die. It's the misconceptions that die. It's the illusions that die. And all of that becomes like the fertilizer and the compost for the new growth to come, which will be sweeter and it'll be more nourishing and it'll be more nutritious and in every sense.